We're going to take some time now to have a look at Elizabeth's background, and you might find it helpful to think of Elizabeth's story and the story of how she was born and why she became queen as being part of two much bigger stories that were already well underway when she came on the scene. The first of these is the story of the Tudors. This is Elizabeth's family. You can see them here. They're also the royal family. There were 5 English Tudor monarchs in England, and that's because in 1485 Elizabeth's grandfather, who was an English nobleman called Henry Tudor, won the War of the Roses and became Henry VII. Now, the other story that's going on at this time is the story of changing beliefs, changing religious beliefs, and we're going to start with that. Because when Henry Tudor became Henry VII, England was a Christian country, and it was a sort of Christian called Roman Catholics, which meant that everybody in the country, more or less, belonged to the very powerful, very influential organisation of the Roman Catholic Church, which was run by the Pope in Rome and really spread through Western Europe. And the Roman Catholic Church controlled people very effectively in a number of ways. One way was that it controlled people's beliefs. People believed in the Roman Catholic explanation for the universe, and this included explanations about life after death. The Roman Catholic Church taught that people had souls which would live forever even after their body died, and that what happened to your soul when you died depended on how well you followed its teachings. So people who disobeyed the church were said to be going to hell, which was a horrible place where you would be tortured in incredible pain for all eternity. People who followed the teachings of the church really closely would go to heaven, where God and the angels were, and it's nice and everybody's happy. And then most people would go to purgatory, where they would be tortured, but only for a few 100,000 years until they were good enough for heaven. You can imagine that for your average medieval peasant, this is a really scary idea, and people obeyed the Catholic Church because they were really, really scared of going to hell. So it controls people's beliefs. It also controls people's knowledge and understanding quite closely. This is partly because churchmen were some of the few people who could read and write, which meant that they sort of controlled what people knew. They also used the old Latin language, the old Roman language even, of Latin in their Bibles and their services and their prayers, which means that people have to rely on the church and the churchmen to explain what the Bible says and what they think Christianity is about. So it's powerful from that point of view as well. It can also control people's behaviour. In England, they have something called the church courts. And these could punish people, sometimes quite severely, for what they called moral crimes. You could be put to death if you challenged the church or said that it was wrong. You could even be fined for not going to church, so it's powerful in that respect as well. It's also very wealthy. Catholic Church owned 20% of land. It could also collect 10% of everybody's income in a sort of tax called a tithe. And it's just a huge part of people's lives. People were baptised by the church after they were born. They were married by the church. When they died, they were buried by the church. They went to church at least once a week. They would play sport on the church grounds after the service. The church provided them with festivals and days off, which were called holy days, which is where we get the word holidays. So it's a really, really big part of people's lives, and it forms a massive part of how they understand the world and the universe. However, by the late 1300s and the early 1400s, people are starting to ask questions about the Roman Catholic Church. They're starting to point out that the priests and the church workers and the monks don't always follow the church rules. They're starting to wonder why the church is so rich when so many people are so poor. and they're starting to wonder whether the Catholic Church is interpreting the Bible and interpreting Christianity correctly. Now, a huge turning point for this, because remember, you could be put to death for doing this, but a huge turning point comes in 1517 when a German monk, whose name was Martin Luther, nails a big long list of criticisms of the Catholic Church to the door of the Church of Gutenberg in Germany. It's such a long list that it's known as the 95 Theses. And this really encourages people to start asking more and more questions about the Catholic Church and Christianity, and to start thinking about how they would want the church to be if they had a church, and how they would interpret the Bible. And they start to protest, and they protest so much that they become known as Protestants, or Protestants, because that's easier to say. And these new ideas and these questions and this discussion sweeps across Europe, and it becomes known as the Reformation, because people are reforming their ideas. When I represent the Protestants, you'll see that I usually do it with a plain glass window. This was a key difference between the Protestants and the Catholics. Roman Catholics believed that churches should be very richly decorated, and they would have stained glass windows and lots of gold and silver. One of the ideas that Protestants come up with is that churches should be plain, and that the money should be used to help poor people instead of decorating the church. So that's an important difference. The Protestants also want to see English Bibles and English prayers, or at least they do in England, so that people can understand them. Remember as well that the Catholic Church really, because it's been there for hundreds of years and it's really told people how to understand the universe, this is a very unsettling, very scary time, with a lot of upheaval in it. Now at this point we're going to come back to the other story of the Tudors, because this really plays a role in what happens in the 1530s when Elizabeth's father, whose name is Henry VIII, is king. He's king from 1509 to 1547. And in the 1530s, he changes the English Church from being Roman Catholic to being Protestant, and he makes himself the head of it. So in the 1530s, I'll just write it here so we can see it, the church goes from being Catholic to being Protestant. So I'll write that there. And this isn't because Henry has Protestant beliefs. It isn't. He doesn't. He has Catholic beliefs, but by the 1530s, he really wants a divorce from his wife. She's called Catherine of Aragon. The reason he wants a divorce is because despite the fact that she's had many pregnancies and several children, most of them have died and she hasn't had any sons. Instead, she's only had one surviving daughter whose name is Mary. And Henry is really concerned about having a son so that there can be another Tudor king when he dies. Now, because at this point England is a Catholic country, he asks the Pope for a divorce and the Pope says no. So Henry's solution is to remove the English Church from the Roman Catholic Church, make himself the head of it, and then grant himself a divorce. It's actually called an annulment. It means that he says the marriage never counted in the first place. He then marries one of his girlfriends, whose name is Anne Boleyn. And she very quickly becomes pregnant and gives birth, but unfortunately for her, not to a son, instead to a daughter who is Elizabeth. She becomes Henry's wife in 1533, which is also when Elizabeth is born. By 1536, Henry has accused her of all kinds of really horrible crimes, like adultery and treason and witchcraft and incest, and she gets executed for them. So when Elizabeth is 2.5, her mother is executed, and her father claims then that she is illegitimate, which means that he wasn't ever really properly married to her mother. This is a big deal at the time because it affects whether or not people can have the throne later. He does later change his mind about that. But for a while, Elizabeth is sent away to live elsewhere. Henry then marries another girlfriend called Jane Seymour, and she dies whilst giving birth to Henry's long-awaited son, whose name is Edward. So Henry then goes on to marry 3 other women, and then he dies in 1547, and because he's the only boy, Edward then becomes king at the age of 9. He only survives to the age of 15. And when he dies, the throne passes then on to his oldest sister, who is Mary. Mary rules from 1553 to 1558. And then when she dies, Elizabeth becomes queen from 1558 to 1603. Now, there's still this problem of religion because Henry changed the church over. He made it Protestant, but he didn't change the rules to be Protestant. He kept it with the same old Catholic beliefs. When Edward takes over, he makes it very Protestant. He removes the stained glass windows, he introduces an English prayer book, and the church becomes very Protestant. However, Mary is a Catholic, and when she becomes queen, Edward VI and Mary I, she then changes the church back to Catholic. She rejoins the Roman Catholic Church, and England becomes a Roman Catholic country again. Now, Elizabeth is a Protestant, but by the time she takes over England, it's a very divided and very unstable country.